Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're taking a deep, slow dive into a true story that reads more like a surreal nightmare about maritime logistics than anything real. We're talking about the Ghost Shipment. This wasn't just a simple case of a boat getting lost at sea. No, this was the colossal, meticulously planned disappearance of $100 million worth of contraband. That's enough white powder, enough sheer financial weight to destabilize a small nation's economy. And it all vanished, without a trace, right off the coast where the water gets deep and the rules get murky. Just for a moment, picture this. It's the dead of night. The sea is like black velvet stretched taut under a quarter moon. The only sound is the rhythmic, almost sleepy groan of a mid-sized cargo vessel, the M.V. Triton. You're somewhere on the bridge, the smell of stale coffee and salt clinging to the air. Then, over the crackle of the VHF radio, a voice cuts through the static. It's the captain, but this isn't your usual maritime chatter. This is pure, undiluted panic, muffled by wind and a bad connection. He's gasping, trying to get a bearing out, trying to say something about a breach, about being empty. The transmission doesn't just end, it dissolves, like sugar in water, leaving behind only the sickening hiss of dead air. That was the last official communication anyone had from the Triton before she became a ghost ship. You're standing there, listening to that silence, and you realize you just heard a distress call that reported the impossible. The ship is safe, but the $100 million payload is not. It's the most high-stakes, surreal crime scene imaginable. And frankly, this is the kind of case you might not survive, given how many powerful people didn't want it solved. So, before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel, and if you're listening right now, I'd love to know where you are. Drop a comment with your location and your local time. It helps me picture who's sharing this strange, dark journey with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The initial search was a complete disaster, built on a foundation of confusion. When that distress call came in, the watch officer at the nearest Coast Guard sector made a logical assumption. The word breach means a whole breach, right? They figured the vessel was taking on water, so they scrambled air patrols and cutters, fully expecting to find a sinking freighter, or at the very least, a damaged one trying to limp its way back to shore. For 12 agonizing hours, they found nothing but endless, churning water. Then, a breakthrough from an unlikely source. A commercial airliner, flying a standard route, spotted her, the Triton. She was listing slightly, just drifting like a huge, rusted bathtub toy. She was completely abandoned, but perfectly afloat. There was no fire, no collision damage, no gaping holes in her hull. Structurally, she was fine. That single fact alone set off the first serious alarm bell in the investigation room. If the ship was fine, what in the world did the captain mean by breach? When the boarding team finally rappelled down and secured the ship, the silence was almost deafening. Every piece of equipment was intact. The navigation systems were powered down professionally, the galley was tidy, and the bridge log was up to date. It looked less like a crime scene and more like someone had just stepped out for a minute and forgot to lock the door behind them. Except, of course, for the cargo holds. According to its manifest, the Triton was carrying 3 specific categories of goods, all perfectly legal on paper: machine parts, bulk grain, and something called Container 77B, which was listed as industrial resins. That container, 77B, was supposed to be the key to this whole mess. When the team descended into the vast, echoing belly of the ship, they found 77B. It was locked and sealed, just as the manifest promised. The seals, those little metal tags that act as a container's chastity belts, were all intact. A small detail, right? Well, that small detail turned into a massive, unsolvable riddle, because when they finally used hydraulic shears to force the container door open, expecting to find either industrial resins or, more likely, $100 million of cocaine, they found air. The container was completely, professionally, empty. There wasn't a trace of powder, not a single bag strap, Not even the faint chemical residue you'd expect from the resins if they had been there. It had been scrubbed clean, top to bottom, with the kind of obsessive focus you usually reserve for cleaning your apartment right before your parents come to visit. Think about the sheer, mind-boggling scale of this operation for a second. $100 million in product, which translates to tens of tons, maybe 20 metric tons, roughly the size of a small truck, was somehow removed from a sealed, locked container on a ship in the middle of the ocean without damaging the container itself, the official seal, or the ship. It's like trying to remove the toothpaste from the tube without unscrewing the cap. It's an impossible crime. And that impossibility leads to one chilling conclusion: the crime didn't start on the ocean. It means the crime started long before, with logistics, with paperwork, and with a series of tiny, perfect lies woven into the fabric of global trade. That initial distress call, that panicked, fading whisper about a breach, it wasn't about water flooding the hull. It was about the breach of a criminal transaction. Someone, whether it was the captain or someone reporting to him, had just realized the promised cargo was physically gone. The ship they were sailing was already a ghost. They weren't just carrying empty space, they were carrying a death sentence. The mystery of Container 77B wasn't just about what was missing from the ship's hold. It created an intellectual black hole for the investigators. I mean, how do you even begin to investigate a crime that leaves absolutely no trace? The first thought, the most obvious one, was that the swap must have happened before the ship, the Triton, ever left port. It had to, right? Moving tens of thousands of pounds of product onto a cargo vessel in the middle of the open ocean sounds like something from a bad spy movie, not real life. But then there's the problem of the seals. Remember those? The little metal or plastic tags on the container doors. They're designed to break the second anyone tries to get in. The seals on 77B were perfectly intact. So, if the seals were fakes, they were incredibly good fakes, made by someone with access to industrial-grade equipment, not a couple of guys in a back alley. To unravel this, the Joint Task Force of DE and Customs agents had to become forensic data analysts. They started by creating a digital footprint of the Triton's final days, tracking every single minute leading up to that final, fading distress call. The Triton's journey began in the bustling, somewhat chaotic port of Cartagena, Colombia. This port is a hive of activity, processing everything from agricultural exports to legitimate trade goods, and, let's be honest, a colossal amount of illicit cargo hidden in plain sight. The first clue came from tracking the ship's automatic identification system, or ICE transponder. Every large vessel has one, constantly broadcasting its position, course, and speed. For months, the Triton had maintained a predictable, almost boring schedule, a sleepy pattern that just screamed legitimate business. Then, 2 weeks before its final voyage, that pattern broke. The ship executed a series of bizarre maneuvers that, on a navigational chart, looked like a drunk spider trying to draw a circle. It spent 3 whole days just drifting slowly, seemingly aimlessly, about 50 nautical miles off the coast of a remote Venezuelan island. An island that, let's just say, has a long history of being a place where things that shouldn't be seen are temporarily unseen. Investigators immediately flagged this as a major anomaly. Why would a ship just drift? Ships burn expensive fuel when they drift. Captains lose money. Unless, of course, they're waiting for something. Waiting for something small enough not to register on standard radar, but large enough to transfer a massive amount of product. The first theory was a rendezvous with a high-speed go-fast boat. But if that was the case, why was the container empty after it had already left the port? It just didn't make any sense. So, they went back to the source, the original departure from Cartagena. They subpoenaed everything, every port authority, CCTV tape, every loading manifest, every security guard sign-in sheet, going back a full week before the Triton sailed. This kind of deep dive is absolutely mind-numbing. We're talking about sifting through thousands of hours of grainy, low-light footage. Imagine watching a security camera feed of an industrial park for 168 hours straight, just looking for one tiny, suspicious flicker of movement. It's the complete opposite of glamorous crime fighting. It's what you might call forensic accounting for ships, and trust me, If there's one thing less fun than regular accounting, it's maritime forensic accounting. But their persistence paid off. What they found was a masterful demonstration of professional misdirection. On the exact day that container 77B was scheduled to be loaded, the port experienced a completely unexpected, totally localized power outage. It only affected Pier 4, the exact pier where the Triton was berthed. This outage lasted for precisely 14 minutes and 32 seconds. It was just enough time for the main lights to go out, for the security cameras to switch to their backup power, which often means lower resolution or slight delay, and for the human security guards to be distracted by the sudden, inconvenient darkness. During that brief window, the original, legitimate container, the one that was supposed to be holding industrial resins, was somehow bypassed or swapped. How? The CCTV footage, which was frustratingly dark and shaky during the power flicker, showed a forklift moving quickly, much faster than protocol allowed, right up to the vessel's side. It was carrying a container that looked identical to 77B, and here's where the logistical genius of the whole operation comes into play. The containers themselves are interchangeable. They all look the same. The only thing that really matters is the unique ID number stenciled on the side. The investigators realized the cartel didn't need to replace the entire container. They just needed to replace the labels and the paperwork. By cross-referencing the container's history, they made a stunning discovery. The actual container 77B, the one that would leave the port with $100 million worth of product inside, had been sitting quietly in an isolated corner of a different, nearby container yard for nearly 2 weeks. It was already loaded with the contraband, locked, sealed, and ready to go. The Triton's official manifest listed the legitimate industrial resins container number, but in that 14-minute window of darkness, the labels and the electronic data were seamlessly switched. The ship sailed with what looked like legitimate paperwork, but the container it was actually carrying was the one filled with drugs, already locked and sealed by the cartel with their own perfect, fake seals. The empty container that the investigators found was likely the legitimate one, maybe swapped back later, or perhaps it was a third, decoy container used purely to create the illusion of integrity. The true container, the one now designated as 77B on the ship, was the one carrying the payload. This single realization completely shifted the entire focus of the investigation. The crime wasn't the disappearance of the cargo at sea. The disappearance was just a clever exit strategy. The real crime, the true masterpiece of deception, was the perfect insertion of the drugs into the legitimate supply chain. The people who pulled this off weren't simple smugglers. They were logistical masterminds who knew the port's infrastructure inside and out. They knew its security blind spots, and they even knew the maintenance cycle of its backup generators. This forced the task force to look beyond street-level dealers and start hunting for a deep-pocketed, technologically advanced organization that could orchestrate such an impeccably timed and perfectly documented deception. The sophistication of the loading operation was the first major clue. That brief, timed power outage at the port, the swift forklift maneuvers, the perfect duplication of container seals. This wasn't a low-level operation. We weren't dealing with a few guys in ski masks with bolt cutters. This was corporate-level infrastructure applied to high-stakes crime. When investigators traced the paper trail of the fraudulent container, the one that was supposed to be holding industrial resins, they found it was leased through a shell company based in Panama. That shell company, in turn, was owned by a holding group registered in the Cayman Islands, and that holding group, it was ultimately tied to a seemingly legitimate agricultural export firm based in Guadalajara. That's where the name surfaced, the Serranos. Not a street gang, but a cartel built on the idea of ruthless, almost bureaucratic efficiency. Think of them less as drug kingpins and more as the silent, very well-dressed CEOs of global narcotics delivery. While other cartels were busy fighting turf wars and leaving flashy trails of violence, the Serranos had mastered the art of the quiet trade. Their specialty was seamless integration into global supply chains. They didn't just bribe one guard, they owned the entire logistics firm. They didn't steal one truck, they owned the fleet. Imagine the classic mob movie tropes, then subtract all the drama and add an MBA, The Serranos were known for their almost obsessive focus on redundancy and documentation. They filed taxes, they kept impeccable records of their legitimate businesses, and they used cutting-edge encryption for even the most basic communication. They were, frankly, boring, which, in the world of illicit trade, is the ultimate superpower. You want to be so predictable and so integrated into the legal world that the system simply overlooks you. It's like the criminal equivalent of painting your yacht beige. No one ever suspects the beige yacht. The organization chart of the Serranos was strangely flat for a cartel. It was run by three brothers: Alejandro, the finance guy; Benito, the logistics mastermind, the one responsible for that 14-minute power outage; and Carlos, the enforcer, who rarely had to enforce anything because the first were so good at their jobs. The Triton shipment, the one now carrying a vast fortune of product under the guise of industrial resins, was Benito Serrano's masterpiece. This was his proof of concept: a perfect, non-violent, untraceable delivery system. Benito's genius was understanding that the biggest vulnerability in maritime shipping, in the open sea, it's the paperwork. He knew that once a container is officially cleared and sealed in port, very few people, especially in the middle of the ocean, ever check inside again. The paperwork becomes an assumption of truth. The Triton was simply one piece in his elaborate, global jigsaw puzzle. The D had been tracking the Serranos for years, constantly frustrated because every time they got close, the trail dissolved into legitimate-looking shell corporations and offshore bank accounts. The Triton was the first time they had a direct, physical link to the Serranos' operation that wasn't purely financial. The fact that the massive cargo was now aboard the Triton meant they had confirmed Benito's logistical capability. The next logical step was to look at the crew. Who would knowingly sail with a vessel carrying such an enormous, potentially dangerous load? You need people who are either incredibly loyal, incredibly desperate, or, preferably, both. And the Serranos, being the meticulous planners they were, wouldn't risk a large crew. More crew means more chatter, more chances for a weak link, and a bigger payroll. Remember that detail from the beginning. The ship was abandoned, but the log was up to date. This wasn't a standard, Union crewed freighter. The manifest showed a skeleton crew, captain, first officer, and for essential engineers and deckhands. The roster was strangely minimalist, almost too efficient. It was a perfectly adequate team for a medium-haul voyage, but it lacked the usual redundancy: the extra cook, the additional relief officer. It was a crew designed not for comfort, but for absolute operational necessity and silence. When investigators cross-referenced the listed crew members, they hit another Serrano roadblock. The 4 deckhands and engineers were all listed with legitimate, but very recent, documentation. They were maritime workers. Yes, but they had only been hired through a temporary staffing agency owned, indirectly, by Alejandro Serrano. Their files were spotless, but their digital footprint was almost zero before 2 months ago. It was as if they had been created specifically for this job. They were ghosts, too. This left only to people whose identities could provide a genuine lead: the first officer, Marco Velasquez, who vanished entirely, and the captain, Alistair Thorne, the man who made that final, panicked, fading transmission. He was the only true variable in Benito Serrano's otherwise flawless equation. And the man's past, once the investigators started pulling at the thread, was not just murky. It was a total immersion into the deep end of professional discretion and quiet failure. The Serranos weren't looking for a hero to sail their ship. They were looking for a man who had everything to lose and was already halfway to being broken. The name Captain Alistair Thorne just sounds like it belongs on a weathered brass plaque, doesn't it? Like a man who spent his whole life battling the elements. But the truth is, Thorne was a man running on the fumes of his past. He had a hidden history, a trail of quiet failures that, ironically, made him the perfect choice for the Serranos. Remember Benito Serrano's obsession with efficiency. He didn't want a loud, ambitious captain, he wanted someone he could control. When investigators dug into Thorne's past, they found a slow-motion tragedy. 15 years ago, he was a rising star in international shipping. Then came the incident, a devastating oil spill. It was caused by crew negligence while Thorne was asleep. He was cleared of any crime, but his career was ruined. He lost his prestigious license, his big-ticket contracts, and his confidence. After that, he just drifted. He took on sketchy temporary contracts, commanding everything from rusty fishing trawlers to yachts owned by people who preferred to pay in cash. By the time the Serranos found him, Thorn was living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in debt, and carrying this quiet, chronic guilt. He was the perfect, flammable mix of desperation and competence. So the Serranos made him an offer he couldn't refuse, a command contract with a 7-figure bonus, deposited into a blind offshore account, all upon successful delivery. The only catch, he couldn't ask any questions about a specific shipping container, number 77B, and he had to use the exact, minimal crew they provided. For a broken man like Thorn, this wasn't just a job. It was a chance to claw back his dignity, or at least, pay off his ghosts. Now, let's talk about that crew. I mentioned they were like digital ghosts. The official roster listed just for people: 2 mechanics, a ship's mate, and the first officer, Marco Velasquez. These guys were basically mercenaries of the sea, handpicked because they had no family ties or public digital footprints. They weren't hardened criminals, necessarily, but professionals paid exceptionally well to follow orders and keep their mouths shut. Think of them like high-seas gig workers, hired for one lucrative, morally flexible job. Marco Velasquez, the first officer, was Captain Thorn's shadow and the Serranos' ultimate failsafe. Unlike Thorn, Velasquez had no maritime career to protect. His background traced back to paramilitary groups in Central America. He was highly disciplined, a skilled navigator, and utterly ruthless. Investigators believed that once the Triton left port, Velasquez was the one truly in charge. His job was to make sure Thorn stayed on course and, most importantly, to protect container 77B at all costs. He was essentially the container's personal bodyguard. The other deck hands and mechanics were vetted just as carefully. They were given specific, highly controlled tasks, managing the engine room, performing routine maintenance, and standing watch. Crucially, none of them had the clearance or the means to get into the cargo hold, let alone near container 77B. It was a classic case of compartmentalization, a technique Benito Serrano loved. No single person, besides Velasquez and Thorn, knew the whole plan. If one crew member got nervous or was arrested, they couldn't compromise the entire operation. This small, silent crew made the logistics of the disappearing act even more baffling. They were way too few people to manually offload tons of material in the middle of the open sea. This brought investigators right back to the original riddle. How did $100 million in cargo vanish from the ship without a single sign of forced entry or prolonged activity? The focus remained on that critical window of time between the Triton leaving Cartagena and the captain's frantic final call. The voyage was supposed to take 7 days. The distress call came on day 5. During that period, the crew would have been locked in the monotonous routines of ocean travel, standing watch, eating, sleeping, maintaining the massive engine humming beneath their feet. Life at sea is mostly long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The Serranos exploited the boredom. The investigators reviewed satellite imagery from the entire route. They looked for high-speed vessels, small crafts, anything out of the ordinary. The only major event they found was a massive, fast-moving tropical storm that swept right through the Triton's path on the night of day 4. And this detail became crucial. Severe weather is every sailor's nightmare. But for a meticulously planned crime, a violent storm is the perfect cloak of invisibility. It grounds air surveillance, it scrambles radar, and it gives the criminals a perfectly legitimate reason for making erratic maneuvers or suddenly dropping communications. You know how a little rain is annoying, but a proper hurricane thus makes you want to curl up and listen to true crime podcasts. It's that ultimate sensory contradiction: total chaos outside, total comfort inside. Well, this storm hit the Triton hard. Captain Thorn, who was an expert seaman despite his career troubles, would have had his hands full just keeping the ship from capsizing. And this distraction was all part of the plan. The investigators theorized that this was the moment the real action happened, completely masked by wind, rain, and a total lack of witnesses. The storm wasn't an obstacle, it was an accomplice. But that still leaves the biggest question: what kind of action could possibly involve moving 20 tons of product without any heavy machinery? The question lingered, pulling them further and further away from a simple dockside swap theory and into the realm of a truly audacious, novel crime. We have the motive, the flawless logistics of getting the cargo on board, and the silent, ghost-like crew. Now, we just need to figure out the impossible means of extraction. Before the Triton even left the docks in Cartagena, the whole operation was already a success. And it all came down to a quiet, genius swap right there at the port. The secret wasn't some dramatic gunfight, it was the mind-numbing, everyday routine of global shipping. Just picture it, endless stacks of steel containers, cranes moving them around like giant Lego bricks, the constant hiss and clang of machinery. This chaos, this sheer volume, was the perfect camouflage. The plan for Container 77B, the one with the contraband, was a masterpiece of misdirection. The man behind it, Benito Serrano, understood something called container fatigue. When you see thousands of identical boxes day in and day out, your brain just switches off. You stop really looking and start relying on the system, on the computer screen. So, Benito didn't try to sneak a container in. He just made sure the right paperwork got attached to the wrong container. It all started with a 14-minute power outage on Pier 4. This wasn't an accident. It was triggered on purpose by a small EMP device, disguised as maintenance gear, set off by an accomplice in a nearby warehouse. The goal was simple: knock out the CCTV cameras and force a brief switch to manual checks, which are always slower and way less thorough. In that short window of darkness, two things happened lightning fast. First, the original, legitimate Container 77B, filled with industrial resins, was lifted and moved out of sight. In its place, an identical but empty container was set down. This was a decoy, just in case someone got suspicious later. Second, the real contraband container, which was already staged nearby and sealed with fake seals, was quickly moved into the now vacant spot. But the real magic trick was digital. The Serranos had a mole, someone buried deep inside the port's computer tracking system. As soon as the contraband container, the one physically labeled as 77B, was loaded onto the ship, this mole instantly updated the port's digital manifest. The paper manifest the captain held was correct, showing industrial resins. But the computer system now matched the real container on board. The final weak link was a tired customs official at the end of a 12-hour shift. He did his final check. Did he climb up and inspect the physical seals on the container? No. He just glanced at his computer screen. The screen showed the manifest matched the container ID, green light, everything looked perfect. So, the Triton sailed with what was officially industrial resins, but was actually $100 million in product. It was a security breach achieved not with force, but with boring, overwhelming accuracy. You know, it's like trying to cheat on a diet. It's not the big slice of cake that gets you. It's the dozens of little pretzels you grab and forget to count. Small details, massive results. This proves one crucial thing: the cargo was definitely on that ship when it left port. That empty container later found in the hold, it was either the original resin container, somehow swapped back at sea, or, more likely, a pre-planted empty decoy. The Serranos loved having backup plans, but if the drugs were on board, and the ship was later found empty but completely undamaged, there's only one possible conclusion: the cargo was removed at sea. This brings us to the most impossible part of the whole heist: the oceanic extraction. On board, we have a compromised and desperate Captain Thorne. We have First Officer Velasquez, the quiet enforcer, and we have the ghost crew, the skeletal staff just trying to keep the ship running. We know a massive storm gave them the perfect cover. The Triton sailed directly into that tropical storm on day 4. And right around that time, its ICE transponder, the system that tracks the ship's location, started acting up, sending out corrupted data. The captain would have just chalked it up to the storm's interference. That happens all the time. But that erratic signal wasn't just weather, it was a signal. It was the moment the clock started ticking for the extraction team. Down in the cargo hold, Velasquez would have been getting ready for the most dangerous maneuver of the entire journey, and he wasn't preparing to open the container doors. That would break the official seals and leave behind obvious, damning evidence of tampering. No, he was getting ready to breach the container in a totally unexpected way. A way that required specialized equipment and would leave absolutely no sign of entry on the exterior door. This single detail, the how of this disappearing act, elevates the crime from a simple smuggling job to something else entirely. It's like a logistical science experiment. It's the part of the story that still keeps investigators up at night. How do you make $100 million of product vanish from a sealed steel box in the middle of a hurricane without a single trace? The voyage of the Triton was completely normal for the first 3 days. Smooth sailing, calm seas, but on day 4, everything changed. The ship entered the edge of a massive tropical storm system that was brewing in the middle of the ocean. For Captain Thorne, a seasoned sailor, the violent waves and blinding rain were a familiar enemy. He probably spent hours glued to the wheel, his knuckles white, fighting with every ounce of his strength against the raw power of the storm, just trying to keep his ship from capsizing. And that's exactly what the mastermind, Benito Serrano, had planned for. The storm wasn't just a convenient cover, it was a weapon. It was a psychological tool designed to keep Captain Thorne and his legitimate crew laser-focused on one thing and one thing only: survival. They wouldn't have the time or the mental space to notice anything else happening on their own ship. Then, around the AM on day 5, right as the storm reached its most ferocious peak, something strange happened. The Triton's automatic identification system, or EYES, the transponder that constantly broadcasts a ship's position and speed, started acting up. It didn't go completely silent, because that would have set off immediate alarms for sabotage. Instead, its signal became corrupted. It started sending out broken, garbled data packets. On tracking screens miles away, the Triton's location and heading looked erratic, jumping all over the map. This is actually a pretty common side effect of a severe storm, so nobody raised an eyebrow. The distant monitoring stations just logged it as weather interference and moved on. But this digital blackout was no accident. It was a carefully calculated move. First Officer Velasquez, who was secretly Serrano's man on the inside, had installed a powerful signal jammer right next to the EYES antenna. This device amplified the atmospheric interference, creating a complete, albeit temporary, digital blind spot. This was their window of opportunity. Over the next 90 minutes, as the Triton pitched and rolled so violently that would make even the most hardened sailor question their life choices, Velasquez and his hidden ghost crew got to work. Remember Container 77B, the one that was officially listed as carrying industrial resins, but was actually holding a $100 million payload. It was buried deep inside the cargo hold. Velasquez knew better than to try and tamper with the front doors. Those doors had official customs seals, and breaking them would be an instant red flag. So, they went through the floor instead. Most shipping container floors are made of marine-grade plywood, making them the container's weakest point. Using specialized, military-grade plasma cutters, which operate almost silently and produce very little smoke. A crucial detail in a confined space, Velasquez's team cut a large rectangular hole directly into the floor of Container 77B. It was just big enough for a person to slip through and pass bags of the valuable cargo backup. This is the brilliant part. The reason why the official seals on the container doors remained perfectly intact when the ship was later inspected. The evidence of the break-in wasn't on the outside. It was hidden underneath the container itself, but there was a catch. To get to the bottom of the container, you first have to get through the floor of the ship. The Triton, like many modern cargo ships, was designed with something called a tween deck just above the main cargo hold. Velasquez's ghost crew, using tools they had smuggled aboard disguised as heavy maintenance equipment, cut a matching access point into the floor of this tween deck, directly beneath Container 77B. This wasn't some crude hack job. It was like surgical precision. The cuts were clean, professional, and made with a deep understanding of the ship's structural integrity. This strongly suggests that Serrano's team had obtained and meticulously studied the Triton's blueprints long before they ever leased the vessel. So, with a hole in the ship's deck and a matching hole in the container floor, what did they do next? They started dropping the contraband straight through the ship's hull into the raging ocean below. Now, I know what you're thinking. Did they just throw $100 million into the storm? Of course not. That would be an incredibly expensive and foolish mistake. What they were actually doing was dropping the product, which was packaged in extremely durable, neutrally buoyant, and specialized waterproof bags into a waiting retrieval device. The vessel that had secretly rendezvoused with the Triton wasn't a speedboat or another cargo ship. It was a specialized semi-submersible craft designed to operate almost entirely underwater, submerged and completely hidden by the chaotic waves of the storm. This retrieval vessel was positioned with pinpoint accuracy directly beneath the breach point in the Triton's hull. The process was brutally simple and lightning fast. Velasquez and his team passed the bags of cargo down through the hole. The retrieval team waiting in the semi-submersible below simply pulled the bags into their craft. The violent motion of the storm not only muffled the sound of the cutting and the movement of the cargo, but also made it practically impossible for any passing radar or satellite to detect the nearly stationary, almost fully submerged craft hiding directly beneath the Triton. It was the perfect crime, happening in plain sight yet completely invisible. Once the entire $100 million payload was extracted, Velasquez and his team didn't just sail off into the storm. Their mission wasn't over. They had to leave the Triton looking like a perfectly normal, empty ship that had simply been the victim of a strange event. They used a fast-setting, structural epoxy resin, the very industrial resins that were listed on the ship's cargo manifest, to seal up the cuts they had made in the container floor and the tween deck. The seals were flawless, completely flush with the surface, and chemically identical to the surrounding floor material. To any inspector, it would look like nothing had ever happened. And then, with the ship seemingly intact and the evidence of their heist completely erased, First Officer Velasquez quietly neutralized Captain Thorne. We don't know for sure what happened in those final moments. Did Thorne finally realize the true nature of the situation and try to send out that fading distress call after the cargo was already gone? Or was he still heroically fighting the storm, completely unaware that his ship had been looted right under his nose? We may never know. But at the exact moment, the extraction was complete. Just as the breach was supposedly discovered and the ship's signal went completely silent for good, Velasquez, his ghost crew, and the $100 million vanished. They abandoned the Triton swiftly and silently, using small, motorized life rafts launched from the far side of the vessel, away from the worst of the storm's fury. They left Captain Thorne all alone on the bridge of an empty ship, left to face the impossible, baffling reality of the Ghost Shipment. The Triton was now a ghost ship in its own right, its precious cargo spirited away into the storm, leaving behind nothing but questions and a mystery that would baffle investigators for years. Thanks for watching, and if you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries. When the Coast Guard boarding team finally set foot on the drifting Triton, a profound, echoing emptiness greeted them. The ship itself was sound, perfectly seaworthy, but completely dead. No crew, no signs of a struggle, and nothing to suggest a standard pirate attack. Pirates take the ship or the cargo, not just the contents of one specific container. So, all eyes turned to Container 77B, the source of all the speculation and weird paperwork. They found it locked and sealed, just as it should be. But when they cracked it open, it was completely empty. This discovery blew the initial theories out of the water. If the cargo had been swapped at the port, the Serranos would have just loaded an empty box to begin with. Why go through all the trouble of an elaborate extraction at sea? The fact that the ship was abandoned mid-voyage meant the drugs had to have been on board at some point. And Captain Thorne's fading distress call, that whisper about a breacher, confirmed the moment it all went wrong. Forensic specialists swarmed the container. They used everything from UV lights to laser scanning equipment, searching for any trace of residue, but the interior was clinically clean. Frustration was building until a sharp-eye technician, an Agent Ramirez who specialized in marine welding, noticed something. It was subtle, almost imperceptible on the container floor. hidden by years of wear and tear. A rectangular section, about 6 feet by 4, was just as smooth. Ramirez used an industrial sensor to check the density of the wood in that area. Her suspicion was confirmed. It was significantly different from the rest of the floor. They used a microdrill to take a core sample. What they found was astonishing. A layer of wood fiber had been seamlessly bonded with a dark, high-density epoxy resin. This wasn't a repair job. It was a professional concealment. Underneath that epoxy, the core sample revealed the clean, unmistakable edge of a plasma cut. The discovery was electric. It proved the extraction happened through the floor. The drugs weren't stolen from the sea. They were intentionally dropped into it to be recovered from below. This changed everything. This wasn't just smuggling. This was a high-tech operation requiring serious maritime engineering expertise. Investigators immediately checked the tween-deck floor, right beneath where container 77B had been sitting. And there it was, the other half of the puzzle. A similar, expertly patched section of the ship's steel deck, the cuts sealed and painted over with marine-grade camouflage paint. The crew had literally built a chute to drop the goods out of the belly of the ship. The ingenuity was staggering, but it was also damning evidence. It meant the entire crew was in on it, or at least the Ghost crew and the first officer, Velasquez. But that left one question: where was Captain Thorne? They found him in his cabin. He was unconscious but alive, secured to his bunk with soft restraints. He had mild hypothermia and severe dehydration, but he was physically unharmed. And tucked into the ship's logbook, they found the only piece of physical evidence that was part of the ship's structure: a small, tightly folded note. The note was written on official Triton letterhead in a clean, educated hand that wasn't Thorne's. It was addressed to the authorities. It read, "We thank you for the timely transport of our goods. This transaction is completed. The captain is unharmed. Do not seek the others. Your involvement stops now." And it was signed, ABC, a mocking nod to the three Serrano brothers, Alejandro, Benito, and Carlos. This wasn't a threat. It was a sarcastic, professional sign-off. It was the cartel's way of saying, "We filed our exit form." After receiving medical attention, Captain Thorne was interrogated. He was still in shock, haunted by what had happened. His story was disjointed but consistent. He confirmed the storm, the signal problems, and the sudden, paralyzing fear when Velasquez locked him in his cabin. Thorne swore he knew nothing about the plan until that very moment. Velasquez had simply told him, "Your contract is complete. Captain, we found a faster delivery route." Thorne's desperate distress call was made after Velasquez had left, when he realized his golden ticket to getting out of debt was already gone. Thorne confirmed that the mysterious Ghost crew answered only to Velasquez, who spent most of the voyage monitoring the hold, not the bridge. And he provided the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Just before the storm hit its peak, Velasquez ordered the ship to slow down dramatically and maintain a steady heading, even as the waves grew enormous. He was creating a stable target, a fixed point for a rendezvous. The recovery vessel wasn't just using the storm for cover. It was being guided into position by Velasquez's precise commands. The cut and sealed hull, the recovered captain, and that mocking note left no doubt. The $100 million cargo was successfully extracted in the middle of a massive storm. The Serranos had achieved the impossible, a silent, deep-sea transfer that made the ship's most valuable asset vanish, leaving the hull perfectly intact. The only question now was how. How could any vessel operate with such precision in those conditions? The evidence was undeniable. The surgically clean cuts through the Triton's hull, sealed with high-density epoxy, told a very clear story. The cargo hadn't gone off the side. It had gone straight through the floor and into the sea. This realization shifted everything. The investigators started feeling less like cops and more like marine engineers, and it led them down the deepest, most fascinating rabbit hole of the entire case, a clandestine retrieval using specialized submersible technology. Let's just paint the picture here. We have a Category 1 tropical storm. Massive waves are crashing over the deck, the wind is howling, and the Triton itself is bucking like a wild animal. Now, imagine trying to hold a regular boat in a precise position directly underneath that chaos to catch falling bags of cargo. It's practically impossible. You'd need superhuman seamanship, and even then, the risk of colliding with the Triton's hull would be astronomical. The raw physics of the situation screamed that the retrieval had to have happened below the surface, shielded from the storm's fury. This is where the idea of a custom-built, deep-sea mini-sub enters the picture. We're not talking about a huge military submarine. Those are too big, too loud, and too easy to track. We're talking about a purpose-built semi-submersible vessel, or be even a fully autonomous underwater vehicle, specifically modified for this kind of covert cargo pickup. Remember, the Serrano brothers were the titans of corporate crime. They didn't just move product, they invested heavily in research and development to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. The smuggling world is already familiar with vessels called Narco subs or Bigfoots. These are semi-submersibles that ride almost entirely underwater, with just a tiny cockpit and exhaust pipe visible above the waves. But even those would be dangerously unstable in a storm of this magnitude. Benito Serrano, the logistics genius of the family, would have known this. The theory that began to form was that he didn't just use an off-the-shelf design. He upgraded it. Significantly, the investigators proposed that the Serranos employed a unique hybrid vessel, a craft designed not for long-distance travel, but for stationary retrieval. This sub would have been negatively buoyant, meaning it naturally wants to sink, and it would have held its position using a sophisticated dynamic positioning system, or DPS. These are advanced thrusters that constantly fire to counteract drift from currents and waves. Essentially, this mini-sub would have clamped itself into a fixed position directly beneath the Triton's hull, riding out the storm's rhythm, and just a few meters below the surface where the water is much calmer. It's like finding a quiet corner at a really loud party. The chaos is still all around you, but right where you are, it's manageable. This specialized retrieval craft would have been equipped with a pressurized bay, or be even a custom-made net system. It was designed to perfectly catch the precisely packaged, neutrally buoyant cargo as it was dropped through the hole in the Triton's floor. The storm, which was a living nightmare for Captain Thorne and his crew, was the perfect cover for the recovery team. The massive waves created so much underwater noise that it provided acoustic camouflage. It would have been impossible for any sonar in the area to distinguish the low hum of the sub's thrusters from the general turbulence of the ocean. This high-tech theory wasn't just speculation. It connected back to physical evidence. Remember those strange cut marks found on the hull beneath the epoxy seal? The primary cuts were for the cargo chute, obviously, but they were also small, faint stress marks on the exterior of the hull, near the ship's keel. Agent Ramirez, the team's marine welding specialist, had a brilliant insight. He suggested these could be scuff marks left by retrieval stabilizers' hydraulic arms or clamps that the mini-sub would use to lock itself firmly against the Triton's underside during the turbulent transfer. That single, tiny piece of evidence, those phantom scrape marks, was the physical proof of this incredible deep-sea ballet. It was the handshake between the two vessels, captured in steel. This specialized technology also explained a lot of other nagging questions. It explained why First Officer Velasquez had to order the Triton to slow down and stabilize its course, even in the middle of a raging storm. The retrieval sub needed a predictable, stationary target to lock onto. It also explained why the Ghost crew on board was so minimalist. They weren't there to handle the recovery. Their only job was the highly technical task of breaching the hull and the container floor with precision. With this theory in hand, the D immediately started cross-referencing global databases. They weren't looking for boats anymore. They were looking for sales of specialized deep-sea positioning equipment and high-grade plasma cutters. And, sure enough, they found a paper trail. It led back to yet another layer of Serrano shell companies, this time a marine salvage firm registered in the Netherlands. It was a perfect front. This changed the entire scope of the investigation. The Serranos weren't just transporting drugs. They had built their own private, illicit maritime infrastructure capable of military-grade covert operations. They had the motive, they had the means, and now, the investigators had meticulously reconstructed the method. The focus of the Triton investigation shifted entirely. It was no longer about where the cargo went. That was a closed chapter. The new question was, who funded this astonishingly expensive operation? Building and operating a custom mini-sub, staffing it with technical experts, this requires an astronomical budget, millions upon millions of dollars. It became a classic case of follow the money. The investigators knew that chasing the money trail would lead them not to the product, which was long gone and untraceable, but to the source of the immense power and capital behind the entire enterprise. It would lead them straight to Alejandro Serrano, the finance brother, the man who controlled the purse strings. The hope was that the trail of drug-laced dollars would be far less discreet than the Ghost Shipment itself. The silent submarine may have vanished without a trace, but the electronic fingerprints of money are much harder to erase. The hunt was on. With the technical puzzle of the Ghost Shipment solved, the perfect insertion, the precise breaching, and the daring deep-sea retrieval by that custom semi-submersible, the task force finally turned its attention to the only spot in the Serranos operation that was still vulnerable: the money. The physical drugs were long gone, swallowed up by a global logistics network, but $100 million doesn't just vanish. It has to be moved, accounted for, and most importantly, laundered. This was Alejandro Serrano's world. He was the finance brother, the one who preferred ledger sheets over shotguns. Alejandro's genius was his ability to make dirty money look utterly, mind-numbingly boring. He didn't bother with briefcases full of cash. He used the tangled, confusing structure of international finance. He built layers of ownership so dense they were like a digital fog, a maze designed to exhaust anyone who tried to navigate it. The investigators, armed with global warrants and a team of top-tier forensic accountants, began the agonizing process of tracing the payment for that Ghost Shipment, the Triton. The first threads were easy enough to pull. The initial payment for the lease of the ship, the salaries for Captain Thorne and his ghost crew, the purchase of the signal jammers and plasma cutters, it all came from one place: a large, respectable-looking holding company called Nereus Maritime Investments. On paper, Nereus was a totally legitimate investment group. They specialized in distressed shipping assets, buying up struggling companies. But in reality, it was the front door to the Serrano money laundering empire. Tracing the ownership of Nereus sent the investigators on a dizzying tour through the world's most notorious tax havens. It was like trying to find the source of a bad smell in your house, but every time you open a door, there's just another, smaller, equally expensive-looking door right behind it, all surface, no substance. The ownership of Nereus was split into 3 trusts: Trust Alpha in the Isle of Man, Trust Beta in the British Virgin Islands, and Trust Gamma in Liechtenstein. Each trust was officially managed by a different, highly paid lawyer who was completely in the dark, a perfect straw man. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. The breakthrough, the one crack in the facade, came when the accountants started digging into Trust Beta. This trust had recently made a massive, untraceable wire transfer. It was labeled simply Asset Purchase Capital and sent to a small, obscure commercial bank in Vanuatu, a tiny island nation in the South Pacific known for its extremely lax financial laws. This was weird, very weird. Why move that much money so far away, to a place with zero connection to the Serranos, legitimate agricultural businesses back in South America? Getting the bank in Vanuatu to cooperate was a nightmare. It took 6 months and countless diplomatic hurdles, but they finally subpoenaed the records. The beneficiary account belonged to a company named Coral Key Development. Its listed business purpose: ecotourism and land reclamation. It looked harmless, a classic shell company facade designed to bore you into looking somewhere else. But the D didn't look away. They dug deep into Coral Key Development, and they found that the company wasn't reclaiming any land. They were buying it. They were quietly acquiring vast tracts of privately owned island real estate all across the Caribbean and the remote Pacific. And we're not talking about small plots of land here. We're talking about entire cays, whole remote islands that used to be owned by old European families or defunct shipping magnates. These purchases were happening with incredible speed and involved massive overpayments. The beer was clearly not interested in negotiating. They had unlimited capital and zero desire to haggle. They just wanted the land, no questions asked. And that's when the entire picture snapped into focus. The link was finally made. Coral Key development was the ultimate dead end. It was the destination, the place where the money for the Triton operation, and likely the profits from the drugs themselves, was being parked and legitimized. Think about it, that $100 million cargo, once retrieved from the bottom of the sea, was never moved back onto the mainland. It was transferred to one of these privately owned, custom-fortified islands controlled by Coral Key. These islands weren't vacation spots, they were self-contained, high-security logistical hubs. They had their own private, unregistered airstrips. They had deep-water docks capable of handling that huge semi-submersible retrieval vessel. And they had secure, climate-controlled storage facilities. They were the perfect, invisible endpoint for a ghost shipment. Once the drugs were safely on one of these private islands, they could be slowly and safely broken down. They could be separated into smaller, legitimate-looking shipments and fed into the global market over months, or even years. They would effectively vanish into the background noise of world trade, completely untraceable. The investigation had done the impossible. It had successfully traced the physical cargo through its disappearance into the deep ocean, and it had traced the financial trail through its complex, globe-spanning laundry cycle. But the money trail didn't end with a criminal arrest or a seized bank account. It ended with a map dotted with luxury, heavily guarded private islands. The Serranos had used the immense profits from their ghost shipments to buy themselves something far more valuable than just wealth. They bought sovereignty. They had created their own small, private empires, floating outside the jurisdiction of any single nation. The task force was left facing a bitter truth. They had solved the how, and they knew the who. But in the end, they couldn't touch the where. The game had changed, and the Serranos were now playing on a board of their own creation. Solving the case of the ghost shipment was one of those hollow victories, the kind that leaves investigators feeling like they've just drawn the blueprint for a perfect house fire without ever catching the arsonist. They had the technical details, they had Captain Thorne's testimony, and they had a meticulously detailed financial map of Alejandro Serrano's offshore empire. They knew the $100 million cargo was probably sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse on a private island owned by Coral Key Development. But the physical evidence, the drugs, the semi-submersible, First Officer Velasquez, and the rest of the ghost crew had all vanished into the quiet obscurity of international waters and private property laws. The final phase of the investigation became a bureaucratic grind. Subpoenas were issued, international treaties were invoked, and diplomatic pressure was applied to the tiny nations that harbored the Serranos' assets. But Alejandro Serrano had structured his private empires perfectly. The islands were owned through complex trusts that made seizure or search warrants nearly impossible to execute without overwhelming, undeniable proof of a specific crime on that specific territory. And the drugs, of course, were no longer in transit. They were stored. The Triton investigation eventually wound down, officially filed as an unresolved case of advanced maritime theft involving narcotics trafficking. Captain Thorne, who was found to be more of a victim than a perpetrator, was granted immunity in exchange for his full testimony, which was instrumental in piecing together the timeline. He disappeared soon after, likely living out his remaining years quietly, trying to outrun the trauma of realizing he had sailed a $100 million Trojan horse for one of the most advanced criminal organizations in the world. I like to imagine he switched careers and now designs really secure shipping container locks, just to maintain some balance in the universe. First Officer Velasquez and the ghost crew were never found. They were professionals, and the Serranos, being meticulous employers, would have ensured they were paid handsomely and given the means to disappear into new, untraceable identities immediately after the extraction. They were simply absorbed back into the global ether of anonymity, the ultimate reward for silent service. Benito Serrano, the logistics mastermind, and Alejandro Serrano, the financier, continued to run their operations from the safety of their legitimate-looking headquarters in Guadalajara. They simply adjusted their techniques based on the lessons learned from the Triton incident, not lessons on how to avoid detection, but on how to make the paper trail even more robust. The $100 million cargo became a successful proof of concept, a blueprint for future ghost shipments. The legacy of the Triton, in about a massive bust or a high-profile arrest. It's about the quiet whisper it left in the world of maritime crime. It forced global law enforcement agencies to confront a terrifying new reality. The criminals weren't just exploiting the seams of the system. They were buying and operating their own parallel systems. They proved that, with enough capital and enough technical expertise, you could achieve perfect insertion, perfect extraction, and perfect disappearance, all within the legal framework of global shipping. The case became a chilling cautionary tale, shared in hushed tones between customs agents and naval intelligence analysts, the unsolved whisper that acknowledged the Serranos' mastery. The true significance of the Ghost Shipment is that it blurred the line between legitimate logistics and illicit trafficking. It showed that the biggest security threat wasn't the pirate on the surface, but the technically brilliant criminal operating seamlessly within commercial structures. You could put tracking devices on every container, but if the paperwork is perfect and the exit is impossible to predict, all the tracking in the world is useless. The Serranos didn't need to fight the system. They simply leased it, used it, and then left it empty but intact, a hollow monument to their logistical brilliance. And somewhere, on a perfect, quiet, private island, a fleet of specialized semi-submersibles is likely getting a fresh coat of beige paint for the next impossible job. The night is finally fading out now, and the images are starting to soften around the edges. You can almost feel the gentle rock of the water, that slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean as the Triton, the ghost ship, finally slips past the horizon. It's quiet now. The static from that broken distress call is long gone, replaced by the soft hum of the night settling around you. Forget the chaos of the storm, the tension on the bridge, and the cold metal of that empty container hold. All that's left is the sound of the deep, a vast, indifferent ocean that swallowed a perfect secret and then simply moved on. There's no shouting, no sirens, just the sound of the waves returning to their steady, sleepy rhythm. Take a deep, slow breath. Let that massive, silent space of the open sea absorb any lingering tension you might feel. The lights are dim, the fan is softly pushing the air, and you're safe, grounded, right here. Let the silence be the final word on this journey tonight. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. We'll see you then.